Oh, I had us muted. Hello, everyone. Scott Roberts here with Explore Scientific, and this is our program Explore Now. Tonight with me is Gary Palmer. Gary Palmer is from Wales, and he is known around the world as an amazing astrophotographer, especially in the solar world. He has images that have been published in magazines and articles all over the world. He is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and the assistant director of the Equipment and Technical Section, I don't want to get this wrong, of the British Astronomical Association. Gary is a great friend to astronomers everywhere. I met him at Daystar's solar day that they had, but Gary has been at astronomy festivals, has done outreach. He teaches one-on-one classes, tutorial classes that you can take with him, and he is an Explorer Alliance astrophotography ambassador, and we have a page devoted to him with links back to his website. So if you're so inclined to get some tutorial from Gary, you should take him up on it. Because although self-taught, Gary Palmer's images really often shake what professional and amateur astronomers have thought that astrophotography could be. He's made images that are truly mind-blowing, and we're really honored to have him with us tonight. So, Gary, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for asking me to be on. Hi to everyone else. What I thought we would do tonight is keep things relatively simple, because it can get quite complicated in the world of solar, and we can get quite lost. But there's lots of different ways of presenting this as well, and one of the easiest ways to keep this simple is to do it by images and run through some of the images. And then once we've done that, we can move into some of the actual processing, how we're processing some of the images up and creating the final image at the end of the day. So first off, what we're going to do is go into here, and we're going to have a look at some of the wavelengths, because we're fortunate enough now to have lots and lots of different wavelengths to look at, and technology has moved along over the last decade. Beginning of the decade, really, it was calcium and Hydra Alpha, which was the most popular to look at, and white light. So white light really encases all of what a camera can see through the equipment, and we're normally using the white light with a solar film or a solar wedge. But what I thought we would do is have a look at what we get out of each wavelength first. So we'll start off with white light. These are just two basic white light images captured through a solar wedge and used in a standard high-speed planetary camera. White light's quite difficult. It certainly is from the UK. It's not one of my easiest subjects, white light, and that's due to us getting a lot of interference from high cloud or change in weather where we're on an island. So we do find it varies quite a lot, but we generally get very well defined sunspots in white light, and we can also start to pick up a lot of granulation on the surface. Also in these, you can see a lot of structural detail on the light bridges inside the sunspot, and that does depend on the magnification and type of cameras that are used. If we move over to starting down on the photosphere area, right down on the solar surface, it works a little bit different in a sense once we come outside the center of the sun. The sun's actually cooler down on the surface than what it is higher up in its atmosphere, up in its chromosphere. So when we're looking at the surface of the sun, we're generally looking in the cooler area, the blue, if we're looking at the visible spectrum. And here we're looking in calcium H line. And you've got two areas of calcium. One's calcium K line, and one is calcium H line. You generally find as we get older, calcium K line is really hard for people to see through. They can't see a lot of detail because our eyes deteriorate, or if you've got things like cataracts. So a few years back, Daystar come up with the H line, and that's more appealing to people as you get older. You can see a lot more detail through it. Although they are quite bright, there is still quite a lot of detail to be seen. But if we're looking at this, it's sunspot in H line, and if we look at here, we've got a group of sunspots in H line again. And to get in this close to the sun in the UK is probably about once every 5 years in calcium.
Wow.
And calcium does get disturbed by the Earth's upper atmosphere. Any disturbance in that, it really upsets what goes on. And certainly makes imaging harder. So generally in calcium, you're normally going to see full disk images or slightly closer than that. This was one, I think it was taken last year, and as you can see, the sun's been very low in activity, so there wasn't really much going on here. But in calcium K line, and this would probably be about 7 or 8 years ago, you can see we had a lot more activity. And calcium can show a lot of detail. You can even see some of the brighter prominences in calcium, again depending on the conditions. As we move up the visible spectrum, we start moving up towards the green. Yeah, we're going to move into magnesium. Now magnesium's only really been out a couple of years and is still really, really new. So to try and work out everything that you can see in magnesium is quite hard, to be honest. There's very, very little data written on anything from anywhere in the magnesium wavelength. And really, to be honest with you, the easiest way of putting this is if you start using magnesium and you start imaging magnesium, you are part of what you might say is the forefront of solar astronomy. Because there's very little on it, the more and more imaging and the more and more data people will start to look back at. One of the things with magnesium is it's a lot more stable to image through than calcium. It shows us quite a lot of the areas that calcium will show, gives us quite well-defined sunspots, and it's also been starting to show up other phenomenon on the sun, other objects that you can't see in other wavelengths when we've compared it side by side. But it's still fairly new, and the next sort of 5 years will progress further with that. When we move up a little bit more, we're starting to move up into sodium area, which is really the sort of orangey area, amber area, and you don't necessarily see so much detail on like solar flares, the brighter points that might come through the photosphere, but you certainly do see a lot of granulation and a lot of different effects. And again, it's a lot clearer than white light for imaging through in poorer conditions. So yeah, it's another toy to the toolbox is really the way I look at it. So different conditions demand different things and different days.
Sure.
I
wanted to take
I've only ever done
a moment
helium
here.
when I've been at Daystar.
Yeah, let me take a little bit of moment to recognize some people that are here. We
Okay.
have Paul Cotton from Cornwall, Ansel Puri from LA, Peter Visima from Toronto, Canada, Bergman Scooter, who watches almost every show, is with us tonight.
Yeah.
David Levy's watching. He says hello. John
Hi, David.
O'Neill, outreach ambassador in North Carolina. Chuck Ayub from Chuck's Astrophotography is watching.
Yeah.
Paul Brierley from Cheshire, England. is
Yep.
watching, and then we got Jeff Wise from Northern California. They all say hello, and they're all glad you're
Hi
here.
all.
So yeah,
That's great. Thanks for watching.
and Amy the Astro is on with us too. So we got people checking in. Again, we're simulcasting on Facebook and YouTube, and it's great to have everybody here. And I'll let you I'll let you jump back in here.
Okay, cool. As I was saying, helium, I've only ever managed to get a couple of images with out at Daystar when I was out there a few years back. I think that was when we actually met out there.
Right.
I was had a few toys out of the workshop there and was able to play in helium. It looks very interesting and does show different detail there to what we see in the other wavelengths. But cost, they're quite expensive, the helium units, so it's not something I've really played around with that much. And again, it's something when you move it from, say, like the US, or you go to Australia, or you come to the UK, it could vary quite a lot on conditions. So without playing with it in poor conditions, I wouldn't really go any further with it. But it does look interesting, and it's quite nice to compare with other units. Really, once most people move on from white light, they move into Hydra Alpha, some form of dedicated telescope normally to start with, or they might, in this day and age, they move on to something like the Quark, which are attached onto most refractors, or there's another version that are attached onto reflectors like the SCTs and things like that. But this sort of image would be an average image for most people moving into the Hydra Alpha world. So we start to see prominences which you don't really see in the other wavelengths, and we start to see here, even though it's quite active areas on the sun. Once we start working a little bit harder, we attach Barlows to it, and then we start creating mosaics. So this one's a full panel mosaic to create an area that we can zoom in a little bit closer and make the image a little bit more defined. As I've moved on over time, I've changed a lot with the equipment and moved forward, so that we're starting to get closer and closer. So we're starting, this is the sort of level that I can come into on a relatively clear day in the UK.
Oh yeah.
In HA. So we're getting a lot of structural detail in the Chroma Sphere, very defined on the sunspots, and we start to pick up lots of things like element bombs and other active points around any active region. So the whole of this area that I'm running the cursor around here is really what we class as the active region, and that would be the area where any of the flares would come out of at any point. The other thing that we see would be something like this, prominence.
Oh, yeah.
The difference with the prominence is, I'll sort of run into it in a minute, but really this is what a lot of solar astronomers are after. This is this sort of thing. So they're capturing the prominences. This one was done on relatively small equipment. It was actually done on a Explore Scientific 80mm triplet. That was about 3 or 4 years ago, something like that. But yeah, conditions weren't overly brilliant, and you can normally tell that by the actual surface of the sun. It starts to go flat, so even though you can get the brighter detail in the prominence, the surface will tail off and it's not really sharp there.
There's a question from one of the people watching. They want to know how long you've been doing astrophotography.
I've been doing astrophotography about 12 years. I've been into astronomy for a long time. Solar astrophotography I've been doing for 9 years.
Very good.
So really it's a case of now looking at a couple of the common objects. So I mentioned the prominences, so we go straight in with the prominences there. Now, prominences really when a structure gets near the edge of the sun. So as the sun rotates, the way that we look at it, and you'll get a defined structure across the surface of the sun, and as it gets to the edge of the sun, we're now seeing the light through the side of it, so we're actually seeing the structure. But a prominence and a filament are really the same object. They're changing shape all the time, so these can be there for a couple of minutes, a couple of hours. They can be there for 2 or 3 days, some of them, and some of them literally can come and go within seconds.
Yeah, that is spectacular.
Depending on what you're looking at and the activity on the sun. They can also stretch out massive distances. So if we look at something like this, we're talking probably a couple of 100,000 miles off of the sun, easy, on that sort of distance from the top of the prominence, right the way down to the bottom. And to try and get those in are quite hard, to get detailed images once they start moving out, because you're getting darker and darker as you're going into space. So if we look at the actual filaments, which is what that prominence is when it's on the surface of the sun, so it will look like this. This really what I call a prawn-shaped filament, this particular one. Yeah. And as the sun rotates around, then this is rotating, and all the time it's changing shape right until it gets to the edge limb here, and then it will change into a prominence.
Gary, this has got to be one of the most highly detailed images of the sun I've ever seen. I mean, it is spectacular.
Was done with 2 cameras, as you can see in the text there, if it's that clear. But the left-hand image was done with quite an expensive camera at the time. But it was very, very small. It was only 640 by 480. Right. So to actually create the image on the left, it had to be doubled in size so we could see the detail. But at that time, it was 2012. At that time, technology was still quite backward on cameras, and it was backward on telescopes. Solar telescopes. So we at the time, that was probably one of the most detailed shots. It was certainly the most detailed shot I'd done, and probably one of the most detailed shots really any amateur had done at the time.
Yes.
And it went everywhere. I remember posting it onto the Mead page, and I went back there a couple of weeks later, and it got shared thousands of times off of the page. And at the time, that was probably the shot that made everybody start looking at what we were doing, where we were moving forward with solar, and solar started to become pretty popular.
Yes. Well, you had a lot to do with its popularity, I think. So Chuck gave you the same.
I think that's it.
And
there's a lot of good images now. I think it was, a decade ago, it was fairly quiet. The images were there, but they were quite obscure. And I think social media has made everybody quite popular.
Yes.
Certainly in the solar world, it's worked like that. Moving on a few years, and designing sort of equipment and adapting equipment to really turn these filaments more three-dimensional, so we can see the connecting structures at the bottom. And you got to imagine the sun. When we're looking at these filaments, you're looking at the outer part of everything on the sun. Really, they're right at the top of the Chroma Sphere, and they're connected. And they change shape and they move around, and they're one of the objects that really fascinate me on the sun. Where we've had this solar minimum, we've had very, very few filaments on there for us to look at, and they're really what I'm looking at, or waiting to come back.
Right.
So moving on again with the 3D theme is to try and get these structures to really stand out from the sun. And again, this one's quite a hard object. It was at the time. It's actually 12 images. So each section of this is one image, and then it's put together as a mosaic to actually get the structure in the image.
Holy smokes.
But again, the cameras were quite limiting still. It's only in the last 3 years that we've got cameras that are really, really good.
Yeah. Gary, there's some questions coming up now. Undoubtedly, there's going to be questions and comments. David Levy is saying, stunning images. Amy the Astro, who was on watching us a little bit earlier, she's asking, how do you add in color on mono solar shots? And maybe that's a whole
Yeah.
section that you'll explain later, because we've
Yeah, I
had
was
lots
going
of
to get to that
conversations
when we
about
sort
that.
of get on to the equipment side. But yes,
Yeah. And
in general, we use mono cameras all the time. And that is because a color camera with its Bayer matrix, when you look at each section of the matrix, it has two greens, one blue and one red. Now, in this particular area of the sun, we're looking at Hydra Alpha, which is only red. It's filtered to just red. So if we look at it on that basis with a color camera, it's only using 1 pixel out of every 4. Therefore, we're throwing 3/4 of our data in the bin. So while we get an image there and we can use them, and even I used them right in the early days, color cameras.
yeah.
We get more detail. And again, with the sun, I think a little bit of expression with astrophotographers, they do color it slightly different. Each one has a different sort of shade on it or a different outlook on the color for the image. So everyone is slightly different in the way that they do this, and I don't look at it as any right or wrong. Some blues really make some objects stand out, but technically they're wrong because we didn't image it in that filter, so we didn't use a calcium filter.
Right.
So where that first image right back here was one that really sort of stopped everything at its particular point in time, this last image was one that stopped everything.
Wow.
I came up with an idea for a system, and that was one of the first images out of the system. And even with myself, I looked at it and went, wow.
Wow.
We could really do this. So yes, it's inverted and the background's light. I have other versions of this with the correct background to it. But I left this as it is because that's really how it turned out on the day, rather than sort of going along and changing it all and doing everything else. But it was the first image that we'd really got this sort of much detail from an amateur base on the sun. But again, all of these, it's right in the height of activity. We've got lots of filaments running around all over the place, all right next to the dark areas. And because the image is inverted, they would be active areas. This would all be active here, unless there's a sunspot in there. And then that would shine through white in this because it's inverted. So now we move on to solar flares, and this quite often gets people get confused. If I post up a picture of a prominence, a lot of people say, oh, that's a really nice solar flare. And a solar flare really is an ejection from the sun. So they can last, on average, they last somewhere around, say, 15 minutes from their start point to their end point. If we go to 2017, we had two groups of sunspots move around. If I put up the NASA image, that shows their locations, so you can see them here and here. And they were blown off massive amounts of solar flares every day, all categories. And the flare categories, they generally stay quite low. We're somewhere in the sort of C or M class area. But every now and then we get X class flares which move right up, and they are the ones that eject enough to interfere with radio, interfere with satellites or astronauts, all those sorts of things. And this particular flare here was an X9 flare, which was probably one of the largest in the last decade.
Wow.
So when we look at it in general, it's like this. This is the active area as it's building up. And what normally happens is very similar to the NASA photo there. It will overexpose everything, so it stops us seeing what's going on. And then what I'd done is developed a system where we could actually go through the Chroma Sphere and find the exit point here of where the flare was coming out from. And that was the key. It was to really find this exit point and some of the other detail that was going on around the time of the solar flare.
This is, I mean, this is truly stunning. I mean, look at this. This is incredible detail. It does have that three-dimensional look to it. Uh, just amazing, stupefying imagery.
There's a slightly better, but that one's a slightly more defined version, but not necessarily as sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it
But you can
beautiful, though?
see
Look at
right the
those
way through
bands
underneath
and-
the tunnels here, the loops.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see the exit point of the flare. This is really what I was after doing at the time. I'd been working on it for quite a long time. And it's a case of being in the right place at the right time. You can never be in the right place at the right time with the sun. It's just luck. Quite often when you move over to something, it's already happened or it's changed.
Sure.
Certainly on the solar flare side it is. But with this particular group of sunspots, it meant I could do really probably about 3 weeks worth of work in a couple of days, because there were so many flares, and then we could tune the system down and get the system working.
Oh, it's beautiful.
But basically the solar flare is an ejection out of the sun. It's not one of the prominences or anything else. And the next real sort of thing here, we actually back to this image here, CME, coronal mass ejection. Normally it's caused by a magnetic change, so this particular filament here lifted off of the sun, and I actually missed this because I've been tracking it for 3 days and it was dark in the UK when it happened. It's about an hour into darkness, and everybody's saying, oh, it's all lifting off. And what basically happened was this filament lifted off of the sun, didn't have enough momentum, got drawn down, and crashed back in to the Chroma Sphere of the sun, and that then produced this famous NASA shot here. This massive eruption, and that is a coronal mass ejection. It's ejecting stuff out. Massive force, huge forces are involved with this. I have imaged one. This was the start of it. I've been imaging it as a prominence, and you just looked at it and went, that's starting to lift off, and then it turned into this.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and you're on about in the space of minutes. So right up in the head here is the CME part, which doesn't really stand out as it is in this particular image. But when we moved to the next image, it just got so large that I had to collapse all the equipment down, change over telescopes and cameras, and then come back into it like that. So you can see the head of it here.
Wow.
And that just kept moving out and out and out. But they are ejections from the sun, so they're when you've been doing it quite a long time, you can normally tell with these. You can see by the movement around them, any of the bright points that are there. You can normally tell that something's going to take off at some point.
Gary, let me bring up a couple of comments here. Paul Cotton is saying he's using a 174 mono with a cork Chroma Sphere. Do we need to take separate images for surface features and proms?
Right. That does depend on the settings. I normally I use Sharp Cap generally for my capture settings. For my captures. There is a thing in there called a flats, capture flats, or a flats wizard, you might as well call it. And it was put in there really with solar in mind, that you could flatten the field of view across the image. So using that, I would generally have the histograms somewhere around 70 to 80 in Sharp Cap with a 174 camera, and that would enable me to image the surface and the prominence at the same time. But if the prominence got really large, like either of these two, you would have to image them separately, because this area out the top here is so dark. You're in outer space now, and you've got to think of distances. So you're going to find that trying to get the surface in, the surface is going to overexpose as you're moving further and further out in the field of view. And certainly when you come to this, you would have to do it in 2 shots. But a normal prominence, a normal image like that, you can image as one image. That is imaged as one image. So we're getting all of this here.
Right.
It's a little bit bright out the back there, but you have to remember this was with early cameras. On the quarks now, they carry quite a lot of contrast, and it's certainly worth playing with the settings, the tuning on the quark, and adjusting the band slightly, and set your histogram to around that 60 to 70.
Right. Ansel Puri is asking, he said, is that last CME leaving? Must be bigger than the Earth?
That went out about 200,000 miles off of the sun. So this wasn't even finished at this point. It went out to a point where I couldn't even see it, and it was still going.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, you're talking literally hundreds of times the Earth on this. Average prominences are probably anything up to, say, 10 times the size of Earth. That would be an average height, but this is starting to really move up in distance, away from the sun.
No, Gary,
I think Stephen Ramsden, he caught one in Calcium a few years back, and that was one of the largest prominences imaged in Calcium. It could have even been this same one, but I remember seeing the image, and somebody had worked out the distances on it.
I guess one of the questions I want to ask you, Gary, is, I mean, you've seen the sun in ways that few people have. I mean, you work with it as often as possible. You've been doing this for almost a decade. It's a lot of people. The average person takes the sun totally for granted. They don't even think of it as a star. And you're looking at this living, breathing, seething, object in the sky. How has that changed the way that you view the universe? I mean, you've become kind of intimate with the sun.
It is a big challenge. It's a very big challenge. Let me just close a couple of these down for a second. I can see you there. It does get personal. I suppose I understand a lot more of what it can do and how it can disrupt us as we're moving forwards as a race. Yeah. Right. I look at everything now that we use is electronic, all our communications and things like that. And I look at some of these solar flares, and I think it was 2001 was one of the largest ones imaged, which was an X20 solar flare. And that came off the edge of the sun, and it does cross your mind, one day one of these is going to come wandering down, and what it's going to upset, and what part of Earth it's going to send back to the Stone Age for a little while we actually figure out how we're going to repair everything and get it back up and running. Right. That's my sort of key thing with that. I think from an imager's point of view, you're always trying to better yourself. So you're always looking at images that you did. And I look back at images and I do look at them and go, if only I did that then. Sure. Yeah, what I know now, that knowledge.
Sure.
But I also look at this is also going on everywhere else. All of these stars in the background picture on the desktop there. It's happening everywhere else, and the changes that happen. But I also think our technology is so new. We really, computers, everything is so new. It's only the last 5 years that I've had a laptop that could actually process some of these images on my lap rather than sitting at a big desktop computer or mainframe computer.
Sure.
So I think another 20, 30 years, we're going to understand a lot more just by a lot more people capturing things. The amateurs capture thousands of objects around the world looking out into space. Most of the comets, all sorts of objects are captured by amateurs. So I think that will increase with technology. And I think that will be the key thing. And all of these new cameras that are coming out, they're making it fantastic for capturing the lots and lots of data in very short amounts of time. So most of these images on here are only 1,000 frames captured. So they're not like 10,000 frames or 5,000 frames. There are literally 1,000 frames captured. Well, that means that I can capture some of these images literally within 8 to 10 seconds. It takes a little bit longer on the processing side, but the actual capture means, and that works for me in the UK, because quite often we have days where there's sunshine and clouds, and I can just pop through the gaps in the cloud, pick off what I need, and then sort of work from there. But there are literally thousands and thousands of images on the computers, and so a lot of them are not processed. I've looked at them. Yeah, I know what goes on. I've turned them into a still, so we cut down on the data. But there's thousands of images on there that people have never seen, because you just don't get the time to process all of them. You pick off that 1 or 2 stunning shots for the day or for the week, and that's it. The rest of them sit there. So, but yeah, it does open your eyes, I think, to a lot of what's happening. And a lot of questions, I asked a couple of questions in your other talks as to what people think. I've looked at, the coronal holes, the amount of them over the last 4 or 5 years, whether that's interacting with our weather. I know the official line is no, it doesn't. The sun doesn't interact with our weather in any way. But
come on. It's got to be the driver of our weather.
I can make the point because I'm not linked to anybody, any company or anything else. And the point I make on that is you don't make taxes by saying that the sun affects your weather or affects your climate. All of these governments now are putting massive taxes on everything, and they're going to earn a lot of money. And I'm not saying that we don't increase what goes on, the severity of our weather or our climate. We do contribute to that, but I also think the sun contributes to it as well. So I think that
something was driving it long before we got here. So
that's it. That
and it will be driving it long after we're gone.
And I really do think that's the case with it. I've noticed, and other people have noticed around the world, changes in the weather in the last 5 years. The seeing conditions certainly in the last 3 years in the UK have plummeted dramatically. I know in lots of parts of North America and Canada, they're seeing the same thing, seeing the winters extend out, hotter summers maybe. We've had it the last 2 years where we've had heat wave for the early in the year as well, sort of April and May, that sort of time. Then we're running into rain in sort of what would be our summer, July and August. So there's changing patterns. You're seeing the forest fires everywhere, Australia, US, and certainly out in Greece, countries like that. So it is heating up. But I do think that the quick answer to it is, it's us, and there's not enough money being put into doing any studying on anything because it's not going to raise any money. That's my view on it. But
kind of
I'm sure there's a lot of people that would disagree with that. But that's that's part of discussion. That's part of things. But I am looking at it from what I see on a daily basis. I'm looking at those images. I'm looking at the images that NASA capture, and you sort of putting 2 and 2 together in your head and saying, well, there are things that have changed there over the last 5 years. It's only going to be time. We will need another solar minimum to say this is what's sort of going on, because we can see this now with all of the satellite technology that we have. Even the amateurs can pick up a lot of this stuff now. So, but really, it's a dynamic object. It's good fun It's good to walk out the door in the morning, yeah, point the telescope at the sun, and you never know what you're going to see. That's the
very
beauty.
true. That's very true.
Um,
Um,
so,
uh, uh, I says, Gary, what software do you use for stacking and processing for deep sky
right,
objects and solar?
we're just going to do that.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. There you
a
go.
couple of minutes. Yeah, we're going to jump into that. I don't know
There
what
we
we're
go.
doing like on time for everything, but
Sure. And
what I
I'll
really
hold
want,
the rest of the questions towards the end of your talk, okay?
yeah,
Because
no
I know you're
worries.
going to get into it.
What I was going to do was have a quick look at a couple of sunspots. They're really the last thing, the phenomenon that people will look at in the Hydra Alpha. So two different sort of sets there. They're just sort of fairly basic images, Hydra Alpha images. And then, better close the wrong window then. There we go. Some of the solar equipment. So that was my first solar setup. Yeah, white light
Okay.
filter on the front and a PST on the top and color camera. Yeah, that was all I had. Spent all the money on the actual equipment, so the camera had to wait for a little while before we upgraded that. Then I moved on to the Solar Max 90. That was my main scope for a long time. Had that for a long time. They used to vary quite a bit in quality, as you know. I was lucky. I got one of the really good ones there. And then the Lunt system. Lunt have loaned me a couple of these to play around with sort of long term, and then they go back. And this one we used for quite a while. Had the calcium module on it. As we moved on, I will sort of jump to the quarks, because really the quarks have changed solar astronomy. They totally have. There's nothing that really touches them for their money. You're paying around what you would pay for a PST a few years back. So they're around the sort of $1,000 area. But you can put one of these onto a standard 80mm doublet or triplet, and with the modern cameras, you're so close to the sun. There's just nothing that gets you that close. You got all four of them there. So the red one's your Hydra Alpha, your blue one's your calcium, sodium, on the gold one, and green for your magnesium. But they really are the way forward in a sense of cost. And I think trying to get close to the sun. I use one of these as well. It's a Daystar Quantum. It is a research grade one. This is how we're getting some of the images. I wouldn't say it necessarily gets you as close, but it certainly gives you more detail. But this is more looking at the outside structure of the sun, the outer Chroma Sphere, or we're moving right in. Where I was doing the band shifting to pick up those loops, we're coming right down through the Chroma Sphere and looking at the photosphere in Hydra Alpha. Couple of other sort of toys along the way. That's the Daystar filter wheel, that I used for the Helium when I was out at Daystar. I'd love to have one of those over here to play with, but I need two houses really to sell and buy one. They're quite expensive, and it's any one of these scopes will go on to solar. That's some of the scopes we're using, different daily basis. There's all sorts of stuff we use. So that really sort of covers the equipment. Camera wise, now this is quite important. You'll see on here, this is just a 174 on the back of the Daystar 60mm. What I've done here is I've just literally put the camera on to show there are other are problems in connecting the cameras to solar equipment like this, certainly in Hydra Alpha, and they can cause banding on Newton's rings. So if we look in this image here, we'll see now where the camera's connected, there's a device just there, which is basically a tilt adapter. It's this one's Daystar's one, it's an interference eliminator. And what it's doing is it's tilting the sensor very slightly away from the filter. Otherwise the sensor acts like a mirror, and the light comes through the filter, hits the sensor of the camera, and then it bounces up and down, and it creates these bands or these waves in the images. So now with modern technology and people manufacturing these, we can tilt the cameras. Before, we used to have cameras hanging out with bits of PVC tape on them and all sorts, just trying to tilt them away from the unit. But these are a couple of the cameras. That would be a sort of average imaging rig on a day like this, with clouds milling around and gaps. And there again, that's another one. You can clearly see the adapter on there. Yeah, that gives it the tilt. So really that sort of covers what we're using as sort of equipment and what we're seeing. As for processing the images, I use Auto Stacker at 2. I've tried Auto Stacker at 3, and what I was saying about our problems with high up cloud, real high atmospheric cloud, Auto Stacker at 3 has a problem of it latches onto that cloud sometimes. It sees it moving in the image, so then it distorts our final image. And I've just found that Auto Stacker at 2 works the best for stacking the actual video programs. So we've got one already loaded in here, and this is how I would have it set up. So if we look down the bottom here, we can see how many frames we've got. 1013 frames, and we're just going to change a couple of checkboxes as we run down here. So we're going to make sure it's on surface, going to run down to improve tracking. We keep it on gradient. And we're actually looking at quite large structures in here. This is not a tiny little planet like Jupiter or anything. So we actually want to look at the noise robust being on large features. And then for the really where we're looking at, yeah, the area that is focusing on, yeah, I'll go on to global. Now what we've got to do is find a reasonable frame there. And I can tell you now in this video, there will not be masses because we're so close. So what I'm looking at is the structure around the top of the sunspot, the light bridges there, until we start to get one of them where they're semi in focus, something like that. Once we've moved that along to there, then we just click analyze, and away it goes. The larger the computer, the quicker it'll process it. It really is that straightforward. We do record them as video files, so this is in the SER format. AVI is quite old. Don't use AVI. It takes up too much room on compression, but also if you want to record larger files, say 5,000 frames on something, you're going to find that Windows won't recognize the size of the data file in AVI, whereas SER, it doesn't really have a problem. You could record a file that's 10 gigabyte. It might struggle to move it around, but it can actually process it. I generally set the alignment points for 104, and then we just go over, place them on. I've set the frames to 200 out of the 1,000 to stack. Now, you can do your wavelets or the sharpening in quite a few different pieces of software these days. You can do them in PixInsight, you can do them in, as I am here, Registax. And if you go into the settings, you can set it to send the image straight over to Registax for the wavelets after. So we've already got that checked, and that means it will open up, hopefully, in Registax in a minute. Okay, so we'll open that up full screen, and then we're going to shrink the image so that we can see all of it in here. Initial layer, yeah, is the first thing to look at. So I have them set at linear and the wavelet filter at default. The initial layer here is quite important. if you're doing what we would call full disc shots or very small prominent shots, you haven't got a large aperture equipment, this number needs to be quite low. Yeah, so it needs to be down around 1 or 2. If we're doing something like this, which is coming into the sun at somewhere around an 8-meter focal length in total, then we need to be right up, and we need to run this up to about 4 before we're going to see any change in progress. So I would start somewhere around 4 and then just slide a 2, just move halfway. Okay, so that's too much. So we're going to drop back 1. We're going to come back to initial layer 3. There we go. And then it's a case of balancing these. So what we're trying to do is not over sharpen this. If you over sharpen it at this point, sometimes you can go, wow, there's lots and lots of data here. Look at all of this that's coming out. But there's a couple of things. You're introducing noise, and it actually changing the structure too much at this point of the actual image. Yeah, so we're better off being finer here and maybe sharpening up a little bit better in, say, Photoshop, something like that afterwards. Okay, so we apply that to the whole image to start with. That's a little bit noisy, I can see that from here, so we are going to go back up to 3. There we go, and then we're just going to bring that back down somewhere around there, and then we're going to go dual.
Beautiful.
Okay, that's all done, so we just save the image back out, and then we can drop these back down, and if we go into our folder, that's our image. What we need to do is bring it into Photoshop to tidy it up and do everything else. So I'm going to do that. So the first thing we need to do is crop the edges, get rid of the stack lines, just general tidying up. Crop. Okay, there's a couple of things you can do here. When you're actually looking at the image is quite flat. Yeah, it is a modern trait in the later cameras, because we use less controls with the later cameras. It doesn't show you so much of what's going on in here. So there's a couple of ways around this. You can either do this in the levels. Yeah, you can squeeze the levels up a little bit, and then you can start bringing out some more data like that. You'll see the sunspots starting to darken up, and we're starting to get more structure in there. Or you can do it another way, which is what I do. I've switched this image now into grayscale and switch this into 8-bit mode. And then we run in with a HDR process. Now, HDR toning only works on a surface shot. It won't work on a prominent shot. And that's because the dark and the light background will interfere with the image. If we use HDR toning, we can start to play around with quite a few settings in here. We can drop the exposure down, but we're starting to brighten up different parts of the image. I also bring some of the detail down in this. Yeah, it sharpens the image a little bit too much, but we can play around with all sorts of settings in here. Yeah, so you see the center of the sunspots, they're going really dark. We can light them up a fraction. Any overexposed areas in images, yeah, we can bring those out, or we can calm those down. But with this is quite close into the sun. I probably wouldn't use this shot, this particular image, this actual video. It didn't have a mass amount of good frames in there for what I want. So we're looking at it, that it's an okay image. Most people would be quite happy if they got this sort of thing. Yeah. It's just you start to get more critical. That's the issue.
Yeah,
the other thing is rotation on the
images. Crazy myself, so I think that's an awesome image.
There's lots and lots of things you can do in this. It's still a little bit noisy there from the wavelet, so you can run a despeckle filter through. Where are we? Noise. Yeah, and that will just take the noise edge off of there. And you can manipulate this around quite a bit. There's lots of other things you can do. You sometimes find coming in this close to the sun that you get an uneven field of view, so you'll get one side of the image brighter than the other. That's quite common. You'll just have a quick look in that folder and see if I've got an image there that's like that. Let's have a quick look. These are all pretty uniform on what's going on. That's one of the benefits of using the so let's do a real quick process on that one there. There we go. Put that in. Exactly the same thing, same settings as the last one.
Okay.
What you can find is that using this new flat subtraction in Sharp Cap really does help you keep an even field across the image. But using a tilt adapter can create an uneven field in a sense. So while it's curing one problem of the Newton's rings, it's creating another problem of an uneven field of view. So you can find that you have to come in and sort of straighten out one side of the image compared to the other. But in a sense, that's partly a natural phenomenon, and it depends on what focal length you're imaging the sun at. Because if we think of the center of the sun, and draw a line straight down the middle of the sun, that's roughly, give or take a fraction, around 400,000 to 500,000 miles closer to us than the outer limbs, the edges, because it's a three-dimensional object. So it's like looking down on a football. So what you'll find is anything to the right of that center point at certain focal lengths will be brighter on the left, and anything that you image on the left of it will be brighter on the right, and that's because it's generally brighter because it's closer to us on those two sides. So if we go back to Registax now, this one should process up a lot nicer. It's a lot cleaner image. Yep, there we go.
Excellent.
There we go. So we quickly saved that out.
Beautiful.
And then we'll come straight back in on that image and send that one into Photoshop. And it's just a cleaner, it's a nicer image than that other one. That other one was a little bit rough. I would still use it if I had to, but this one would be a lot nicer. So again, let's crop the stack lines off the edge, and then we change the mode, so we bring it into grayscale. Now if I wanted to HDR this little black point here, I'd probably have to crop it off because it would mess with the HDR. So we'll just do that there. We're going to take a line there to keep the sunspot in. There we go, and move it into 8-bit, and now we can go into HDR. There we go. So you'll see straight away as I brought that in.
Now, Gary, as you're doing this processing, are you adding artifacts that are not in the data?
No,
You're just harvesting stuff that's in the data itself.
It's all in the data itself. So the issue is with this is you're not adding any other data. What it's doing is it's defining what's there. So it's adding contrast in different areas to the image. So if I actually shut that off for a second and we go back into it. So if we look at the filament's there. Sure. Yeah, and the filament's here and over here. If we look down, the problem with the newer cameras is contrast. So if you bring contrast into the image when you're actually capturing it, you end up with your sunspots having absolutely no detail in them, and it can even cover the light bridges as well if you're not careful. So while it looks fantastic on the screen as you capture it, it's not that good when we actually process it up. And that was the problem with the older cameras. When they recorded in AVI and you had gamma and contrast settings on them, they really upset what you could do with the image. So say this active area here, we wouldn't be able to see that. It would just be white. That would be an older image of mine. It would just be white, and that would be down to the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
But by using this process, so now if we left this as a color image, so I'm going to leave this as it comes out of Registax, even though it's mono, Registax will send it out as a color image. And then I do HDR toning on it. It gives it a uniform effect across the image. Yeah, so by using the mono, by actually physically turning the image into mono, you get a lot better structural layout in the image. And that's one of the reasons why I do it. So if we go back there to 8-bit mode, and then we go back to grayscale, that's it, there. And now we run down again to HDR toning. You notice that you're getting it is brighter. So you're getting your brighter points a lot more defined across the image. If we click on the smooth edges, that will actually define any of the element bombs that are in and around these areas, any of the brighter magnetic connecting points, depending on what part of the Hydra Alpha you're imaging at. If we've got some of these areas here which are a little bit overexposed, we can just bring those back down.
I see.
Yeah, to an acceptable level there. And we can also adjust the curve line on this. Yeah, to really your taste, your choice.
Right.
Is what
really adjust the contrast quite a bit.
Yeah, you can sit here for hours and hours playing with this image. There's a lot of detail in there. But if we go back to before and after, you'll see that it's actually brought the structure out in the image now.
Right.
This will be naturally dark in the corner. If you remember, we cropped it off there. So it's over very close to the limb of the sun. So the closer you get to the limb, the darker the image is going to be on that side. But we could sharpen this up now. So we just run a despeckle over it first. And then we can do any number of sharpening processes on this. You could do a simple one, sharp mask, where you can play around with your settings on there. There are add-ins like Astro Image. We could do multi-scale sharpening. Yeah, so we can come in and we can do each of these at our own set levels. There's 101 ways of sharpening the image.
Oh yeah.
But again, it's to be soft with it. Yeah. If you're too harsh with this,
yeah,
at this point,
you get that over-processed look.
Yeah, you'll destroy it. Now, the false color is really simple. I use duotone. Yeah, so go into duotone. Now I can set these colors. So I use tritone, one for black, one for a slight orange tint, and one for a yellow tint. If we're doing calcium, then they will have blue and green tints. If we were doing sodium, they would have more yellow tints. But I can pick any one of these colors out of this system that I want to make to give me my final object.
But what's the right color? Is there any such thing?
Well, tritone is really, it's making sure that you've got black in there, because you need black for your contrast.
Sure.
Yeah, so the other two colors are then mixing to give you your palette that you're going to work on the background there. Now, what I normally do at this point is just give this a little bit of contrast, because if you're not careful here, these white points will suddenly change color. You know, they will go to one of the colors that you're attaching to the image. And now what we need to do is turn it back into RGB. And we can go in there and play with color balance to our heart's content, really. We just give it a little bit of an edge in a couple of different ways. But what we're trying to do is keep those white points white. That's one of the keys on this. Okay.
You know, Gary, you and I have talked about this before, but you know, what is the real color of the sun? You know, and
This is the point, and I think this is what makes solar astronomy quite nice. I go on to one of the group pages, solar activity or something, and there are so many different variations. If we want to give it a little bit of a boost, use the legacy contrast, and we can just give it a little bit of a nudge into the red there, something like that.
Sure.
Now, depending on your camera, how close you are, different images look, or different size images look different when you post them on social media. You might have to rotate this to make it look nice on social media. It depends on the sensor layout to the camera. But some of these letterbox ones seem to post out really large, so they bring out too much detail. That last little bit of contrast there is just a little bit too much, but we can take the whites down, or we can play around with selective color. Yep, so we could come in here and we can adjust just the reds now.
Oh wow.
And I can literally spin this really whatever color I want. Once I've got those base colors from duotone in there, then we can do whatever we want. Yeah, and the same thing again. You can turn it real deep orange, or really whatever we want. And that's it. And then if there's a couple of other things just to bear in mind. Screen calibration. If your monitor is too bright, your image is going to be too dark when you post it out. It's that straightforward. So if you haven't got any way of calibrating your screen, I always say put your screen to about 1/3 brightness. Yeah, so whether it's an actual monitor or whether it's a laptop, you want it somewhere around 1/3 brightness. And that will give you a good image when you post it out onto, again, social media, websites, anywhere else. If your screen is too dark, then your image is going to be too bright. So all of these areas you're looking at are going to be nice, but they're all going to be overexposed where everybody else is looking at them. I set my colors in Photoshop. So my color settings I set to RGB 1998. That's what I prefer for doing all of this, down in the color settings there. So it's actually set up the top, and it tells me when I've got other images coming in, if I want them to actually be set to that color system. But now if you actually save this, when you save these out, is save them as a PNG file, and that will then hold the color in the image. Yeah, so we just go overwrite that image now, and that's it.
Beautiful.
Yep. So now this program here that we're using as a viewer doesn't see the RGB 1998. If you really want to test your image, just open it up in Chrome or Explorer or Edge, whatever your browser is. Just open the image in there and you can check your color on there. Yeah, if you're really critical about it. There you go.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, we have some questions and some comments here. Let's see. One of the questions, could you use a stock DSLR mirrorless camera for HA solar imaging?
You can, but again, I've done solar imaging with DSLR, and Daystar do a Quark adapter. Yeah, so I think it's a camera Quark, they call it, that actually bolts straight onto a DSLR. It will do it, but you are going to lose detail there. Now, one of the tips with the DSLR is in the settings for the camera, you set it to capture a JPEG and a RAW file, and then we set the camera into mono. Yeah. Now, what that does is on its live display, and in the JPEG, it will record as mono, but in the RAW file, it will record as color. But by having it mono on the screen, it enables us to focus. Because if we're looking at a color image of the sun, it's really, really hard to focus. And if we adjust ISOs or things like that, we might get color bleed off of the edge of the sun. And it's very, very hard to get a fine focus. So the easiest way is to set the camera into mono and then the raw file will carry the color automatically of what it's captured, and then you can adjust your colors. You can even so like Canon do their EOS capture software, you can adjust the colors in there in the raw file itself, or Photoshop when you bring it in. Some people just strip the red color straight off, yeah, and they just go into that process very similar to what I was doing with a gray image, and they attach their own color and go from there.
Right. You're by looking at the, I mean, are there other tips that you would advise somebody, like maybe getting under a hood or something like that, so
Yeah,
you
I
can
mean,
keep out straight
I'm
light as
I'm
you're looking
fortunate.
at your
I've got a
screen?
summer house, which is my solar observatory.
Okay.
So the mount's in the door. The door is exactly south, right the way along the line.
Okay.
Yeah, and so everything is fairly simple. I do get caught out at events these days because I'm quite sheltered from the sun. So being in there, of getting really cooked up in the sun, because you forget about it. I'm just in there and I'm imaging away, and I'm looking at things.
Yep.
But yeah, there are a few things. Couple of the, I mean, the standard precaution is never point the telescope at the sun without any form of filter on it. Yeah.
Sure.
I've had people come to me at events and say, "Oh, I've made a Newtonian into a solar scope and it's got no filter on the front." It's like, well, yeah, carry on, mate. Your secondary is going to be down on your primary at some point.
At some point. You're
People
going to be
will
burning the
always
side
play
of the
with things.
tube.
If you're carrying any form of solar scope, like that image I showed with it on the CPC 800,
Yeah.
the PST on the CPC 800, if you're carrying any form of solar scope on your main rig, make sure that your finder scopes are all covered. Yeah, if you do nighttime imaging with a rig, and you're using your guide camera on the guide scope, make sure that's covered. You're going to have no
Otherwise, it's
camera
going to be
left.
fried.
Yeah, that's it. And people have done it,
Sure.
even the finder scope. I can remember forgetting to cover one of mine ages ago, and I thought, wow, that's getting a bit warm on the chest. I looked down, it's coming straight through, and it's starting to burn a hole through the top that I've got on. We all do it. Your mind's on something else.
Yeah.
Covers over the screens and covers over you. It doesn't take long for you to burn in the sun. Certainly this time of year where we're in midsummer.
Sure.
So it's really looking around at safety. I know, some of the societies say, oh, you can use solar projection for events. I don't like any form of projection personally. I've been to lots of events. You get asked 100 questions, and while I'm answering those questions, I can't look at a telescope and keep an eye on what's going on with it. And you only need one child to run around the back of it and grab hold of it, and it's got an eyepiece in there that's projecting to the floor. So that's the reason why I'm never a great lover of eyepiece projection. But if you're there on your own, it's another way of doing it. That sort of thing I'm sort of up for. All I can say is if you play around too much, you will burn lots of things, including yourself. If you look at my desk, there's plenty of burn marks all over the desk. That's because we're taking stuff out and we're putting stuff on. It needs like literally 1 or 2 seconds there coming through the system, and that's even with good ERFs on the front and stuff like that. There's enough power this time of year coming down the scope, and depending on how close we're getting. As I said earlier, some of the images we're doing, they're 8 meters running into the sun, 8 meter focal length. So yeah, there's enough there to fry a lot of things.
Right. Including your eyeball if you get it down there.
Yeah, that's it.
Satish Puri is asking, commenting, it's one thing reading about sunspots and solar flares during school days, and quite another seeing the real images captured by experts. Great. He's commenting from North India. It was 4:30 in the morning when he was watching.
Yeah.
Paul Brierly. Has
Yep.
Gary thought of writing a guide to solar imaging?
Yes, we've been talking about this for a while. I'm not a great book person, but it is something that I probably should do. There's not really much that I don't know about in the solar imaging side or the visual side of it. I tend to concentrate really on the images. So a few people have asked me in the past, and I've sort of started down that path, and I've never really got there. So it is something that I am tempted to look at over the next couple of years. I need to finish all these building projects we've got going on here first, and then get a bit of downtime.
Right. I'm Eddie is leaving us, but asks or comments, I would just color range and select the black background, paste it on top to protect it? Question mark?
Yeah, every person has their own way of doing it. Yeah. The way that I'm doing it there, I've been using for quite a long time, so I've had no real problems with that. Everybody's different. You know what I mean? Everybody's different, and it's also a time thing of how much time you've got to sit down there and process these. I also do deep sky and reviews, and I'm working on projects with cameras in the background, so something has to give somewhere along the lines. Otherwise, you know, when we used to do this with the old Solamax 90 and a DMK 31, you would do your images in the morning, and you would have them processed out by lunchtime. Literally, you pick a handful of images and they would be out. The image files now are so big, I could be processing them in 2 days' time. So I'm generally quite often running now a week or so, you know, so far behind. We just try and get one image out of a main object if something's going on that day. But the rest of the images are lucky if they see the light of day just on processing time.
Right.
And you have to get quite ruthless after a few weeks of, right, we're scrapping that. Yeah, we don't need it. We've got some other bits here. So you're throwing away quite a lot of data just because you can't store it. The new cameras now, average file, there's about 4 to 5 gigabytes per file. Wow. So if you've got a big object, you know, or
terabyte drives to hold
yeah,
images, right?
It just goes on forever.
Right. Angelo Puri comments, these are spectacular images. Thank you for sharing, Gary.
Thank you. Yeah.
Gave a completely new perspective. I think we now know the secret of Van Gogh's impressionist strokes. He had a solar telescope and saw and used what no one else did before. Yeah. John Slynn, does Gary use any additional filters on the webcams during capture, such as an additional UV or IR filter?
No, usually, hi John, I know John, we go back years and years. We use the UVR cut filter, certainly on the quarks and on the quantums. They're generally used as energy rejection up to a certain aperture. So let's say we've got an 80mm telescope, for instance. We put the UVR cut filter in front of the quark, and then the quark would be loaded in behind. And depending on what way you image, I mean, I prefer imaging directly straight out the back of a telescope rather than using a diagonal. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The telescope is keeping the camera cool because it's actually shading the camera. So yeah, it's in the shadow of the telescope all the time. So that's one benefit, and I just find it's easier to balance, and there's less chance of anything spinning round like the diagonal. You accidentally knock it and comes flying around with a camera and a cork and everything else in it. So that's my preferred thing. But you do generally need an 80mm extension tube to run direct out the back of the telescope.
Okay.
So I normally put the UVR cut filter on the end of the extension tube, and then the quark would go in, and then the camera would go in. I don't use any other filters on the actual camera itself, because at that point the UVR cut filter is already working for the mono camera as well as for energy rejection. So there's not really a lot of need. I've played around with Barlows or reducers on the cameras. Yeah, so sometimes if we want to nip in a little bit closer on something and it's a really clear day, then we'll try and get in closer. On another day, we won't. You know, we'll go for the reducer and try and capture something. But I think now really the key thing is its cost. And I'm not being funny, you know, a Solamax 90, a Lunt 152, you're into, you know, 7, 8, 10,000 pounds. Yeah. And the cork, for me, you got that, the cost of your refractor, and you know, you can use a doublet, you can use a triplet. It really depends on your flavor. I mean, people say, oh, can I use a doublet or can I use a triplet? My attitude is normally the triplet's got things like better focuser on it, and it's got better attachments to it, so you get a better quality instrument to use.
Yeah, if you're just buying it off the shelf. We have people buying our AR doublets, okay, for solar imaging, and they will take the focuser, although it's got a 2-speed focuser on it, they'll take it off and they'll put a Starlight or a Moonlight, you know, so they just got better hardware for doing imaging, you know, and you know, so I think that is, although I certainly didn't develop those telescopes for the solar imaging crowd. They're being used for this, and with great results. So
no, they work really well. But it really is you know, this is the thing. For the cost of your telescope, let's say you spend up to £1,000 on that, and you spend £1,000 on a Quark. Your camera you're going to buy anyway. So let's just put a ballpark figure in of say 350 for the camera. You'll wipe the floor with whatever a Solamax 90 or a 152 can deliver. And the beauty is with it is you can move up in a year or two's time. You can go, right, I want to go to a 120 or a 127 or a 152, or the world's your oyster.
That's true. And the filter just kind of moves from instrument to instrument, right?
That's the big difference now. You know, years ago we were stuck with the dedicated solar scope of whatever you could afford to buy, and I think that's the big change now, and really where it moves forwards for everyone. Some people just want a little travel scope, a 70mm and a little filter on the back, and away they go, and they do a little bit of imaging while they're away somewhere, or star party or something like that. It's.
Let's see, what else do we have here? Grant Bauskill says, so many great tips. Thanks, Gary. Looking forward to trying some of these techniques. How does someone interface with you? You know, you gave me a link, which I did put up on your page, for your workshops and your classes. You do one-on-one tutorial, right?
We do it either way. People either ask me to go out to their place, or a lot of it we can do online these days with the technology, and we've certainly had a good kick in the technology with the lockdowns that we've had. We've all had to get up to speed. It's probably been sitting there for quite a while. We've just not adapted ourselves.
We really used it.
That's true. Being honest. So yeah, we can do a lot online now, and we do once all of these lockdowns are lifted and everything else, we'll be back. Some people decide to come to where I am. We've got the facilities here for people to learn for the day. Some people come down and they stay for a couple of days. So people have asked me to go over and set all the equipment up on one day and then run through all the imaging and processing on the next day. So everybody's different in really what they want.
And I imagine that taking one of your classes is going from getting some of the stuff figured out to boom. Now they're
I mean, I see it. And you know, a couple of people are friends of mine, who've grown to be really good friends of mine, and I've seen their imaging we first sort of met over me going over to their place and teaching them, and I've looked at their imaging and see what they can do, within that first couple of days, and that's really good, sitting back and looking at that and seeing them suddenly jump,
Sure.
rather than having that curve that I did, which was probably a good 2 or 3 year learning curve.
Yeah.
Now you get it more or less instantly.
Right.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I can be contacted through our Astro Courses page. Yeah, so it's astrocourses.co.uk, or through social media. Just look me up on social media, and I've also got Gary Palmer's astrophotography page. Yeah, so some people come in through there. We've got the Astro Courses page on Facebook as well. So
you're not
but
blind.
I'm open to everybody. Yeah, so there's no blocking or anything. People can search for me and just literally put up the questions. I answer a lot of stuff online anyway, just generally for people. Quite helpful in getting people started and up and running and things like that.
Paul Cotton asks, is it worth using full aperture 12-inch WL filter or just stay small?
It's not worth it in this day and age. And I know Paul, he's in Cornwall, so it's very similar to Wales. It's either really nice or really wet and really horrible. Yeah. Full aperture in the UK really is quite hard work. I've worked on it a few times, and I've had all sorts of different instruments over the years. Really, with cameras now, we can come in with something like an 80 or 100 millimeter unit telescope, and we can change the camera that we're actually using. So one of my favorite cameras at the moment is the 178, IMX 178, and it means we can come reeling close to the sun just by a very slight change of aperture, or by change of ROI, so the region of interest, which is basically dropping down on the size. So from the full frame image, it's coming in closer. And we're using a lot of that now on deep sky as well. Some of these wide format cameras, when we want to go in close on a galaxy, use the region of interest on it. And that works really well on solar with some of the new stuff. It also brings you in closer, so you get a lot closer.
Right.
I keep saying, in the next 10 years, people will have more cameras than telescopes, for the simple fact that the amount of types of camera that are there now means there's less changing of aperture.
Right.
But large aperture in the UK doesn't work. I really think that if we're being dead honest for solar in the UK, to use it every day of the week, or most conditions here, 127 millimeters your maximum aperture. You can bring a 152 out, on a really good day, but if you're on about everyday imaging, somewhere between 100 and 127 millimeter.
But you can always take a bigger aperture scope and stop that thing down to a smaller aperture scope, right?
You can,
you can't go the other way.
your issue with that, with solar, while that works quite well on the planets, on solar it will upset the equipment if you're not careful, because if we look at the focal length of, say, a quark, it generally works best at somewhere around f28 to f32. So let's just say if we used an f11 102, something like one of the old classic telescopes, it clumps together the prominences. So they now they don't get fine lines in them. They get quite clumped together in their appearance and what goes on. So you're moving the bandwidth of the equipment. Once you start doing this, you're starting to change the actual bandwidth. So if you stop the telescope down, that's fine, as long as you're keeping it in that area of the F ratio that you want to be in. That optimum sort of f28, f32. If you start pushing out the other side of that to the f40s, then you might change the structure of the object that you're imaging. Not necessarily the object, but like Sunspot or the prominence, it might have a different structural context to it.
Hmm.
And if you want to keep the images light and fluffy in spicules and detail and stuff like that, then we need to keep those down quite a bit, you know, and quite sensible. But the world is your oyster with this stuff now. You know, it's so easy. Anybody can go out there and start doing this stuff. And that's what's the great thing. I'm just going to switch this out of screen share now.
There you go. There you go. Millie Russin, I missed the first half of this excellent presentation. Will it be available for replay? Yes, we are. Oh, it says Rich. Hi, Rich. So using Millie as the. Anyhow, yes, it will be both on our YouTube channel and our Facebook channel, and I will save a version of this on Gary Palmer's Alliance page on explorescientific.com. And Gary, if you want the file, of course, I have
Excellent.
the whole raw file, and I'll send it over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Andy Brown, hi Gary, great presentation. After analysis in AutoStacker, how do you use the quality graph to determine how many frames or the percentage to stack?
Don't use it in the UK.
There's your answer.
It lies.
Okay. All right.
So if we put a prominence through there that was really bright, then we would get, you know, an 80% graph across the top. But I would actually know when I was imaging that there was high cloud running through. So I know that it's working on the brightness of the image, and therefore, really, it's not that correct. That's the long and the short of it. So I never use it. It's really, I look at stacking just under a quarter of the frames. So if I recorded 5,000 frames, I would be somewhere around that 1,000, 1,200 area. But sometimes too many frames can upset it. If you've got poor conditions, you're better with less frames. So you might record 1,000 frames in, say, white light and only stack 50.
Right.
But we would have to be a lot more gentle in the processing, the wavelet area, because the noise would introduce. So really you can look at it that the more frames we get in there, the thicker the image is, in a sense. So we've got more chance of drawing detail through on each of these layers.
Sure.
The less frames that are there. So that works the same with recording at high speed. Some people say, oh, I want a camera that records at 160 frames a second. I've got one here at the moment that records at 500 frames a second. They're recording so fast that they don't actually get detail, a lot of detail onto each image.
I see.
Whereas if you slow a camera down now, and you run it at, say, 30 to 60 frames a second, that passes like that. So it's got a lot more data on there.
I see.
It means you stack less frames. So lower frame rate actually works a lot better sometimes with solar, because it means then we can capture 500 frames and we stack 50. We've got a lot more quality in the image.
And these are full frame chips, so it's the clocking, how fast this clocking is happening, right? That's very.
It's just the same as pushing a pen into paper. If it's fast, it's just running the pen across the top, and if it's as slow, it's actually drawing a line into the paper, so that when these pieces of paper stack together, the lines underneath will come through the image.
Got it. Christopher asked, you mentioned a trick to switch a camera to produce mono JPEGs, so focusing using the back of the screen is easier. Does that trick work well for night shots too? He says I need to try that.
You could use it. I mean, it's still going to record a color file. So the raw file, what you normally have on the back of the camera is you have a JPEG, and so I always call the JPEG the holiday snap. It's the ready-made shot. And then you have the option to switch on capturing raw files, and they're the ones you want with anything. Whether it's deep sky, whether it's solar. So the raw file will still capture the color. even though you've got it set into mono. Now, depending on the maker camera, I know this for Canon mainly because that's what I use, but you can switch that mode back when you're in their own software. So when you're in the EOS DDP software, digital development processing software, you can switch that back. So you can actually switch it back to standard white balance and everything, even though I think that's designed for when people make mistakes. They select the wrong setting on the camera by accident, taking a load of images, and then you can correct them back in their own software.
Excellent. I'm going to end this program with a couple of questions, okay? One of them is from Grant Bowskill and one for myself. Grant is asking, what does Gary think is going to be the next big thing in terms of equipment or techniques for amateurs?
I don't know. I think every now and then we hit a little bit of a point where there's a plateau. We've risen up a lot with these cameras at the moment. We've risen up with the technology and coatings on other things. So at the moment, there's nothing there that's really saying to me that stands out on the horizon as a new thing. I can see VR getting involved in some way with the telescope. I think that would be something I can see, whether it be eyepiece related. I can see that side of things coming along. It's getting very big in other areas now, and I don't see a reason why it won't enter into this area.
Or augmented reality, yes.
Yeah, I can see that. Certainly if you've got a planetarium map, Sky Safari, something like that, yeah, where you can actually have the eyepiece, camera eyepiece in there, you're looking at the object, and then you can move into a VR system around it by it being connected to the headset.
That would be fun. That would be a lot of fun.
I can see that coming.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think that would be that far away, to be honest.
Yeah. So, and here's my question, okay?
Yeah.
After all of these amazing images, all the stuff that you've done, and your deep sky stuff. I mean, we were looking at your deep sky astrophotography, which you know, you said admittedly you're not as well known for, but I will tell you that you're among the best. Okay.
Thank you.
That's out there. What do you wish for? What do you dream for? What would be the next big aha moment for you?
I don't think there is a big thing. I think the same as every other astrophotographer, you're trying to improve on what you're doing. But I also like to try and keep things quite simple. The deep sky, I've spent probably the last 3 or 4 years of trying to show people what you can get in a short amount of time, and that's really worked around our working time. Yeah, the amount of time we got to actually put into the hobby.
Sure.
It's worked around our patience. Certainly when we're new getting into this, yeah, there's a level of frustration that's there with everybody, whether it's a speed of that or learning or something. And also it's worked around our weather for the last 3 years. And that doesn't matter in the US or here. We've seen big changes in that. I mean, the last 2 times I've flown to the US, I've not seen the ground from Heathrow, yeah, right the way through to wherever I'm going. It's been like cloud right the way across, you know, right across Canada, yeah, and down.
Sure.
So now we're getting more limited with weather. I've spent a long time teaching people how to capture in short bursts, like an hour's worth of data, and process those sorts of things up. So I think it's sort of continuing that and showing people that there are other ways of doing it. You don't necessarily have to follow a strict regimen. There are some things you have to follow. Yeah, you know, like Kent was saying, and you were saying the other day on, you know, your mount setups, you have to get quite methodical on some of these things.
Yeah.
But once you get used to that, there's a lot of easy things that you can do for capturing. And I think with me, it's just really pushing that out there, and it's just showing people how they can enjoy it and have fun and remove some of the frustration.
Sure, sure. Well, I really want to thank you. You've given us an incredible amount of information, shown us some amazing images, Gave all of our friends out there a great evening to hang out and ask questions of such a great astrophotographer and a great friend to all of us. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank
And
you for asking me.
yeah,
It's been a pleasure. It's been really
it's
enjoyable.
been fun. It's been fun. I hope all of you out there have a great weekend. We have other programs coming up on Explore Now, and I'll be announcing them as they come along. But certainly, Cesar Brolo from Argentina is going to come on. He's putting together a presentation. Dustin Gibson from OPT is going to put together a presentation of his astrophotography and all the stuff that he does. So we've got a lot more coming, and it's going to be a lot of fun. People are saying thank you, 10 stars,
Yeah,
you know.
thank you.
So
Thanks for watching.
yeah,
It's been enjoyable.
yeah, it's been fun. You
Very
have a good
enjoyable.
night. I know it's late, so we'll talk to you later. And
Okay.
keep looking up, everybody. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye bye.